265,000 men. That's more people than live in Orlando, Florida. Now imagine every single person in that city, your neighbors, your family, your friends, trapped in a frozen hellscape, slowly starving to death while two madmen use their corpses as chess pieces. This isn't some Hollywood movie. This is Stalingrad, 1942. And here's the part that will blow your mind. Only 6,000 of those 265,000 men ever saw home again. That's a 97.7% death rate. It all started with one general who never wanted to be there, and two dictators who refused to blink first. If you think today's leaders make bad decisions under pressure, wait until you hear what happens when ego meets reality on the world's deadliest stage. Before we dive in, pause for a second. Ask yourself, what would you do if your boss ordered you into hell itself? Keep that question in mind. But before 250,000 men could die for nothing, someone had to lead them there. And that someone was about to inherit the most cursed command in military history. What if I told you the man responsible for Germany's greatest disaster was actually one of the least fanatical generals in the Wehrmacht? Meet Friedrich Paulus, the methodical professional who inherited a killing machine. Picture this. January 12th, 1942. Western Ukraine, near Poltava. Field Marshal Walter von Reichenau, commander of the German 6th Army, is having lunch with his officers. The 57-year-old field marshal has been fighting off the brutal Russian winter, temperatures well below freezing. Suddenly, his officers notice something's wrong. Von Reichenau looks unwell, disoriented. Then he collapses, not clutching his chest, but struggling to speak, his face contorting. He's having a stroke. This is the same von Reichenau who had transformed the German 6th Army into something far more sinister than a conventional fighting force. Hundreds of thousands strong, they'd participated in the Blitzkrieg into France, Belgium, and the Low Countries. They'd become one of the Wehrmacht's most experienced armies. But that experience came with blood on their hands, civilian blood. Von Reichenau had issued what became known as the Severity Order. Soviet prisoners weren't just enemies, they were subhuman in Nazi ideology. Jewish civilians weren't non-combatants, they were targets for elimination. His orders explicitly stated that soldiers must understand the necessity of harsh measures against Jewish subhumanity. The 6th Army had participated in countless murders across occupied Soviet territories. Mass shootings, executions, systematic cooperation with SS Einsatzgruppen, killing units. Von Reichenau didn't just tolerate this, his orders actively encouraged it. But back to that January day, Hitler's response to von Reichenau's stroke is immediate. Get him back to Berlin for treatment. They load the paralyzed field marshal aboard a transport plane for the long flight home. Von Reichenau never makes it. He dies during the flight on January 17th, near Poltava, likely from complications. A cerebral hemorrhage, combined with heart failure No dramatic crash, just the quiet death of a man who'd shaped his army's brutal character. Enter Friedrich Paulus. Hitler personally selected Paulus as von Reichenau's replacement, surprising many in the Wehrmacht hierarchy. Born in Hesse in 1884, Paulus had served as a staff officer in the First World War. While men like Rommel earned fame through dramatic battlefield victories, Paulus had distinguished himself through methodical planning and competent administration. He understood logistics, supply lines, the mundane but crucial details that keep armies functioning. After the fall of France, Paulus had been reassigned to Berlin, where he helped plan Army Group South's campaign in the Soviet Union. But there was something else about Paulus that set him apart from other Wehrmacht leaders. He wasn't a Nazi Party member. In an officer corps increasingly dominated by true believers, Paulus represented the old Prussian military tradition. He served through professional duty, not ideological fervor. His men found him standoffish, formal, perhaps even cold. This was the reserve of a traditional military professional uncomfortable with the political extremes surrounding him. The appointment was controversial. Other candidates had more combat experience, stronger Nazi credentials, closer relationships with Hitler. Many generals were surprised that Hitler chose a staff officer with limited field command experience. But Hitler valued Paulus's reputation for methodical competence and organizational skill. When Paulus took command, he brought a different leadership style to the Sixth Army. Where von Reichenau had been driven by ideological hatred, Paulus operated through military procedure and professional standards. He was less personally invested in the Nazi racial crusade, more focused on traditional military objectives. But this didn't translate into meaningful resistance to the system he'd inherited. The Sixth Army continued to cooperate with SS killing units under Paulus's command. The machinery of mass murder kept functioning, even if the new commander wasn't personally enthusiastic about genocide. Paulus represented a different type of complicity, not the fanatical believer like von Reichenau, but the professional soldier who followed orders regardless of their moral implications. This distinction matters because it reveals how evil systems function. They don't require every participant to be a true believer. They just need people willing to do their jobs competently while looking the other way. Paulus was the perfect example of what Hannah Arendt would later call the banality of evil, ordinary professionals enabling extraordinary horror through routine compliance. Paulus's first real test as army commander came quickly. May 12, 1942, Marshal Semyon Timoshenko launched a massive Soviet offensive near Kharkov, with roughly 500,000 or more Soviet troops. His goal was to recapture the strategic city and disrupt German preparations for their own coming offensive. For 3 brutal days, Paulus's Sixth Army absorbed everything the Soviets could throw at them. Pitched battles in the mud and spring snow, tanks grinding against tanks, artillery dueling across the Ukrainian steppes. The Germans took heavy casualties, but they maintained their defensive positions. Paulus demonstrated the patient, methodical approach that would become his trademark, waiting for optimal conditions, conserving resources for a decisive counterstrike. That moment came when the Luftwaffe achieved local air superiority. German Stukas and fighters began systematic attacks on Soviet formations, disrupting their coordination and supply lines. On May 17th, the 1st Panzer Army launched a counterattack from the south. 2 days later, Paulus struck from the north. Classic pincer movement, executed with textbook precision. The results were catastrophic for the Soviets. Estimates of Soviet losses range from 240,000 to over 270,000 casualties, killed, wounded, captured, or missing. Against this, German casualties were relatively light, fewer than 30,000 across all units involved. It was exactly the kind of lopsided victory that bred dangerous overconfidence in Nazi leadership. Hitler was ecstatic about Kharkov. Here was proof that his lightning war strategy could work again on the Eastern Front. The winter setbacks had been temporary obstacles, not fundamental problems with German capabilities. All Germany needed was one more decisive push, and Stalin's empire would collapse. But victory at Kharkov masked deeper problems, threatening the entire German war effort. Every tank that broke down took weeks to repair because spare parts were increasingly scarce. Every gallon of fuel burned came from reserves that were already dangerously low. Every artillery shell fired represented resources that would be difficult or impossible to replace. Germany was winning tactical engagements while slowly losing the strategic war of attrition. The oil situation was becoming critical for the Reich. Germany's entire war machine, tanks, planes, ships, trucks, depended on petroleum products. Romanian oil fields provided some relief, but nowhere near enough for a prolonged conflict against multiple enemies on several fronts. Germany was consuming fuel faster than it could be produced or captured. Hitler's solution was strategically logical, but operationally impossible. He would capture the Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus region, around Baku, in present-day Azerbaijan. These fields produced somewhere between 70% and 80% of the Soviet Union's oil production in the pre-war period, enough to fuel German operations while crippling Soviet armored forces. It was the right target for Germany's strategic needs, but completely beyond the Wehrmacht's actual logistical capabilities. Enter Operation Fall Blau, Case Blue, Hitler's grand summer offensive for 1942. The plan called for Army Group South to split into two smaller army groups after achieving initial breakthroughs. Army Group A would drive south into the Caucasus to capture the oil fields. Army Group B would secure the northern flank and capture key transportation centers along the Volga River, including a city that bore Stalin's name. The numbers involved were staggering. Around 1.6 to 1.7 million Axis troops would participate in the offensive. Approximately 1,600 German aircraft were allocated to support operations in the southern theater. It was enormous by any measure, though smaller than the previous year's Operation Barbarossa. German technical units prepared elaborate but unrealistic plans to exploit expected victories. Organizations like the Technical Brigade for Mineral Oil and Continental Öl developed detailed schemes for restarting captured Soviet drilling equipment and constructing pipelines to transport petroleum back to Germany. These preparations revealed the fantastic nature of Nazi planning. They assumed complex industrial facilities could be quickly repaired and operated in active war zones with hostile populations. But buried in the grand strategy was one objective that would consume Hitler's attention completely: that city on the Volga River. Initially, capturing Stalingrad wasn't considered a primary objective. Military planners saw it as secondary to the main goal of seizing oil resources. The plan was to damage the city's industrial capacity, disrupt transport links between northern and southern Soviet forces, and draw Red Army units away from the crucial oil fields. Stalingrad was supposed to be a means to an end, not the end itself. But Hitler became increasingly fixated on the symbolic value of capturing Stalin's city. The propaganda impact would be enormous. Nazi swastikas flying over the Soviet leader's namesake, while Stalin watched helplessly from Moscow. It would represent the ultimate humiliation of the communist regime, more valuable for German morale than any mere military objective. This fixation on symbols over strategy would prove fatal to German hopes in the East. German commanders expressed serious reservations about Case Blue from the beginning. The front line would stretch over 1,000 miles, placing enormous strain on supply lines that were already failing to meet current demands. The reliance on non-German units, Romanians, Hungarians, Italians, to guard the Wehrmacht's exposed flanks was particularly dangerous. These Allied forces had proven consistently less capable and less motivated than German troops throughout the Eastern Campaign. Senior Wehrmacht officers raised concerns about the plan's dependence on the Luftwaffe to perform multiple contradictory missions simultaneously. German air power would have to provide close support for advancing ground forces, protect impossibly long supply lines, block Soviet breakthroughs, and even airlift supplies when roads and railways failed. The mathematics of aircraft availability versus mission requirements simply didn't work. But Hitler dismissed such pessimistic analysis from his professional military advisors. He was already envisioning victory parades through the ruins of Stalin's city, already planning the propaganda films that would celebrate Germany's triumph in the East. As final preparations intensified, an incident occurred that perfectly illustrated both German overconfidence and Soviet paranoia. On June 19, 1942, a German aircraft carrying Major Joachim Reichel crashed behind Soviet lines. Reichel was carrying detailed operational plans for Case Blue, complete with unit deployments, objectives, and timetables. The Soviets recovered the documents and rushed them to Moscow for analysis. Any rational leader would have immediately recognized this intelligence windfall and prepared appropriate defenses. But Stalin's paranoid nature led him to dismiss the captured plans as an elaborate German deception designed to trick him into weakening Moscow's defenses. He believed Hitler was still primarily focused on capturing the Soviet capital, and that the southern offensive was merely a diversion. This was one of Stalin's most catastrophic intelligence failures of the war. He literally had the entire German playbook in his hands and chose to ignore it because it didn't match his preconceptions about German strategy. The decision would cost hundreds of thousands of Soviet lives and nearly hand Hitler the victory he desperately needed. Meanwhile, Paulus found himself at the center of Hitler's impossible equation. His Sixth Army would advance on Stalingrad as part of the Northern Pincer, tasked with capturing a city that was rapidly becoming the Führer's personal obsession. Everything about the mission violated basic military principles that Paulus had learned during decades of staff work. The overextended supply lines, the weakened flanks, the reliance on wishful thinking instead of careful, logistical planning. Paulus understood the risks better than most of his contemporaries. His staff background had taught him to think in terms of supply tonnages, fuel consumption rates, and maintenance requirements. He could see that the mathematics of Case Blue didn't work. Too much distance, too few resources, too many variables beyond German control. But understanding the problems wasn't the same as having the authority or willingness to solve them. The German military tradition emphasized following orders from superior authority, even when those orders seemed questionable. Paulus had been trained to trust that higher headquarters had information and perspective that field commanders lacked. If Hitler and the High Command ordered an advance on Stalingrad, then a dutiful German general would execute that advance to the best of his ability. This mindset would prove tragically inadequate for the situation Paulus was entering. Hitler's strategic thinking was increasingly divorced from military reality, driven more by political symbolism and racial ideology than by practical considerations. The Führer needed subordinates willing to question his judgment and present alternative perspectives. Instead, he got professional soldiers like Paulus, who followed orders competently while hoping that someone else was handling the big picture. As spring turned to summer and German preparations neared completion, the scope of the gamble became clear to anyone paying attention. Germany was betting its remaining strategic reserves on one enormous offensive with troops it couldn't replace, equipment it couldn't maintain, and fuel it didn't have for sustained operations. Success would require perfect execution across multiple fronts, favorable weather conditions, major enemy mistakes, and extraordinary luck for months on end. The irony of Paulus's situation was both perfect and tragic. One of the Wehrmacht's most methodical and least ideological generals was about to lead 250,000 men into a battle defined entirely by ideology and wishful thinking. His attempts to maintain professional military standards would be meaningless when the operation itself was based on impossible assumptions. The weather was warming, the ground was drying, and the Wehrmacht was preparing for what many believed would be the decisive campaign in the East. German soldiers wrote optimistic letters home, talking about final victory and being back for Christmas. Their commanders harbored more private doubts, but even the pessimists couldn't imagine the full scope of the catastrophe approaching. Unknown to Paulus and his men, events were already in motion that would transform their planned advance into the most devastating encirclement in military history. Stalin's paranoia had given Germany a temporary advantage by preventing Soviet preparations for the real offensive. But that same paranoia would soon manifest in orders that would turn Stalingrad into a killing ground, unlike anything the world had ever seen. While Paulus prepared his army with methodical professionalism, Hitler was about to roll the dice on the biggest gamble in military history. And when Stalin finally realized his intelligence failure, His response would make the worst decision possible, turning a tactical retreat into a fight to the death that would consume armies and define the war's outcome. Imagine if someone leaked your enemy's entire battle plan to you, complete with maps and troop positions. You'd use it, right? Stalin literally dismissed it as fake. June 19th, 1942. A German aircraft is flying over Soviet-held territory east of Kharkov. On board is Major Joachim Reichel, a staff officer carrying something that would change the course of the war, if anyone had been smart enough to use it. The aircraft develops trouble and crashes behind Soviet lines. Soviet patrols reach the wreckage within hours. More importantly, Reichel's briefcase survives the crash intact. Inside that briefcase are the complete operational plans for Operation Fall Blau, Case Blue. Unit deployments, attack routes, supply schedules, detailed objectives, and priorities. It's the intelligence coup of the century, handed to Stalin on a silver platter. And he's about to make one of the worst decisions of his life. The documents are rushed to Moscow within 24 hours. Soviet intelligence officers work through the night translating and analyzing the captured materials. What they find should terrify any rational leader: a massive German offensive aimed directly at the Caucasus oil fields, with secondary operations along the Volga River. Army Group South will split into two powerful formations. One will drive toward Baku and the oil fields that fuel 70 to 80% of Soviet production. The other will advance on Stalingrad to secure the northern flank and disrupt Soviet supply lines. Any competent military leader would immediately begin repositioning forces to meet this threat. Stalin does the opposite. His paranoid mind sees deception everywhere. These plans are too detailed, too convenient, too perfectly timed to be genuine intelligence. In Stalin's twisted logic, this must be an elaborate German trick designed to fool him into weakening Moscow's defenses. He's convinced that Hitler's real target is still the Soviet capital, and that everything else is just misdirection. This is what happens when confirmation bias meets military planning. Leaders see what they want to see, not what intelligence tells them. Stalin wants to believe that Hitler shares his obsession with symbolic targets and political capitals. The idea that Germany might prioritize economic objectives over political ones doesn't fit his worldview. Ask yourself, have you ever ignored good advice because it didn't match your assumptions? That decision would cost hundreds of thousands of lives. But here's the controversial question. What if Stalin was right to be paranoid? What if this was a German deception operation? German intelligence had used false documents before, feeding misleading information to enemy agents and double agents. The timing was suspiciously convenient, and the documents were almost too complete to be authentic battlefield orders. Plot twist. Sometimes even paranoids make the wrong call. The documents were genuine, and Stalin's failure to act decisively on them gave Germany a crucial head start. Soviet forces remained concentrated around Moscow and Leningrad, while the real German offensive prepared to smash through weakly defended positions in the south. It was exactly the kind of strategic surprise that had made Blitzkrieg so effective in the war's early years. But even as Stalin made his catastrophic intelligence failure, the German plan he was ignoring contained the seeds of its own destruction. Case Blue was logistically impossible from day one. German planners had created an operation that looked brilliant on paper, but ignored the practical realities of supply, distance, and enemy resistance. The front line would stretch over 1,000 miles from the Baltic to the Black Sea. German supply trucks would have to travel hundreds of miles over poor roads with limited fuel supplies. The Wehrmacht would be advancing into regions where every mile forward meant another mile of vulnerable supply lines behind them. German generals understood these problems better than their political masters. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, commanding Army Group Center, had expressed serious reservations about the operation during the planning stages. He warned that splitting Army Group South into two separate formations would weaken both and make coordination nearly impossible. The reliance on Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian troops to guard the exposed flanks was particularly dangerous. These Allied forces had proven consistently less reliable than German units throughout the Eastern Campaign. But Hitler was no longer listening to his generals. The former corporal had become convinced that his amateur strategic insights were superior to the professional judgment of trained military officers. He'd had some early successes overruling conservative generals, and those victories had fed a dangerous overconfidence in his own abilities. Now he was micromanaging operations from hundreds of miles away, issuing detailed tactical orders to commanders who understood local conditions far better than he did. This is what happens when corporals try to overrule strategists. Hitler had never commanded anything larger than a platoon in the First World War, but now he was directing army groups across a front that stretched from Norway to North Africa. His interference would prove catastrophic for the very operations he was trying to ensure succeeded. The offensive began on June 28, 1942, with General Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army leading one of the initial assaults. Supported by intense close air support from the Luftwaffe, German armor smashed through Soviet defensive positions with devastating effectiveness. Soviet forces, caught off guard by the scale and direction of the attack, conducted a fighting withdrawal that often resembled a rout. For the first few weeks, Case Blue looked like a stunning success. German forces advanced so rapidly that they were often days ahead of their own supply schedules. Towns and cities fell with minimal resistance as Soviet commanders, finally realizing the scope of the German offensive, scrambled to establish new defensive lines further east. Hitler's confidence soared as daily reports brought news of captured territory, destroyed enemy units, and demoralized Soviet resistance. But this early success was masking fatal flaws in the German plan. The rapid advance was stretching supply lines beyond their breaking point. German units were capturing territory faster than supply trucks could follow, leaving advanced formations without adequate fuel, ammunition, or food. The Luftwaffe was forced to use transport aircraft to resupply forward units, taking planes away from their primary mission of providing air support for the continuing advance. By August, the problems were becoming impossible to ignore. German supply trucks were running on fumes, forced to ration fuel that was desperately needed for continued operations. Soldiers were stealing food from captured Soviet settlements because their own rations weren't reaching the front lines consistently. Horses were being slaughtered for meat as the mobile kitchens fell further and further behind the advancing armies. But Hitler was about to double down on disaster. On July 23, 1942, Hitler issued Directive number 45, which would seal the fate of hundreds of thousands of German soldiers. He ordered Army Group South to split into two separate formations as originally planned. Army Group A, under Field Marshal Wilhelm List, would drive toward the Caucasus oil fields with the 1st Panzer Army and the 17th Army. Army Group B, under Field Marshal Maximilian von Weich, would continue the advance toward the Volga River with the 6th Army, 4th Panzer Army, and Romanian 3rd and 4th Armies. This decision violated every principle of military concentration and mutual support. By splitting his forces, Hitler was ensuring that neither group would have sufficient strength to achieve its objectives. Army Group A would be too weak to overcome determined Soviet resistance in the mountainous Caucasus region. Army Group B would be too isolated to maintain its positions if the Soviets launched a counter-offensive. The gap between the two army groups would grow wider every day, making coordination impossible and mutual support a fantasy. Even worse, Hitler then compounded his error by reassigning units between the two army groups without consulting the field commanders who would have to execute these movements. He ordered Hoth's 4th Panzer Army to abandon its advance towards Stalingrad and instead support Army Group A's drive toward the Caucasus. This created massive traffic jams on the few usable roads in the region, as entire armies tried to pass each other while moving in opposite directions. The road networks in southern Russia were completely inadequate for this kind of massive military movement. Most roads were unpaved tracks that turned into impassable mud during any rainfall. The few paved highways became bottlenecks, where German columns backed up for miles, presenting perfect targets for Soviet air attacks. Fuel consumption skyrocketed as vehicles sat idling in traffic jams, waiting for the roads to clear so they could continue their advance. German field commanders were furious about these unnecessary complications. They could see that Hitler's constant changes of direction were wasting precious time and resources that could never be recovered. But the German military tradition of absolute obedience to superior authority meant that even experienced generals like von Bock and List had to execute orders they knew were strategically unsound. Von Bock became so frustrated with Hitler's interference that he began openly criticizing the Führer's strategic decisions during staff meetings. This was extraordinarily dangerous behavior in Nazi Germany, where any hint of disloyalty could result in dismissal, imprisonment, or worse. On July 15th, Hitler relieved von Bock of command, replacing him with von Weich, and effectively ending the career of one of Germany's most experienced field commanders. The pattern was becoming clear. Hitler would tolerate no dissent from his strategic vision, even when that vision was clearly flawed. Professional military advice was unwelcome if it contradicted the Führer's intuition about how the war should be conducted. This created a command structure where important decisions were made by political leaders who had no understanding of logistics, supply requirements, or tactical realities. Meanwhile, as German forces struggled with self-imposed logistical problems, Soviet resistance was beginning to stiffen. Stalin had finally begun to realize his intelligence failure and was rushing reinforcements toward the threatened sectors. The Red Army was conducting a fighting withdrawal, designed to buy time for new defensive positions to be prepared further east. Every day of delay gave Soviet engineers more time to destroy bridges, railway lines, and industrial facilities that might be useful to the advancing Germans. Soviet tactics were also evolving in response to German operational methods. Instead of trying to hold fixed positions that could be bypassed and encircled, Red Army units were trading space for time while inflicting maximum casualties on German spearheads. Soviet commanders had learned from earlier disasters that it was better to retreat and fight another day than to sacrifice entire armies in hopeless defensive battles. This new Soviet approach was perfectly designed to exploit the weaknesses in Hitler's strategy. Every mile that German forces advanced stretched their supply lines further and reduced their combat effectiveness. Every day of fighting consumed ammunition, fuel, and spare parts that were becoming increasingly difficult to replace. The Germans were winning tactical victories while slowly bleeding themselves to death logistically. By late July, some German units were reporting critical shortages of everything from tank tracks to artillery shells. Maintenance crews were cannibalizing damaged vehicles to keep others operational. Infantry units were going days without hot meals because field kitchens couldn't keep up with the rapidly advancing front lines. The Wehrmacht was achieving its tactical objectives while undermining its own ability to continue the offensive. But Hitler refused to acknowledge these growing problems. He was fixated on the symbolic value of capturing specific cities and regions, regardless of the military cost or strategic benefit. The city of Stalingrad had become a particular obsession, its name alone making it irresistibly attractive as a propaganda target. Hitler began issuing increasingly specific orders about how the city should be captured and what should be done with it after occupation. This obsession with Stalingrad would prove to be the decision that doomed 265,000 men. Originally, Stalingrad had been a secondary objective in the Case Blue plan. Military planners saw it as important for disrupting Soviet river transport on the Volga and protecting the northern flank of Army Group A's drive toward the oil fields. But they didn't consider it essential enough to justify a prolonged siege or major battle. The city's industrial capacity was significant, but not irreplaceable from the Soviet perspective. Hitler saw things differently. For him, Stalingrad represented the ultimate humiliation of Stalin's regime. Capturing the city that bore the Soviet leader's name would be worth more than a dozen military victories in terms of propaganda value and enemy morale. He began pressing his field commanders to make Stalingrad a higher priority, even if it meant weakening other operations. On July 31st, Hitler made the fatal decision to redirect Hoth's 4th Panzer Army back towards Stalingrad after its brief detour to support Army Group A. This created even more confusion and delay as the entire army group had to reverse direction and fight its way back through the same traffic jams it had just navigated. Precious weeks were lost to these unnecessary movements, weeks that could have been used to complete the capture of Stalingrad before Soviet reinforcements arrived. The delay gave Stalin time to implement one of the most consequential military orders in history. On July 28, 1942, he issued Order Number 227, which would transform the coming battle from a tactical engagement into an apocalyptic struggle for survival. Not one step back. Those 4 words would define everything that followed. Stalin was abandoning the flexible defense that had served the Red Army well during the German advance. Instead, he was ordering his forces to hold their positions, regardless of the cost in human lives. Any soldier who retreated without explicit orders would be shot by special blocking detachments positioned behind the front lines. Any commander who authorized a withdrawal would face court-martial and execution. The order read like something from a medieval siege, not a modern military campaign. The people of our country, for all the love and respect they have for the Red Army, are beginning to feel disappointment in it. They are losing faith in it, and many curse the Red Army for giving our people over to the yoke of the German oppressors, while the army runs away to the east. Stalin was willing to sacrifice entire armies to prevent any further retreat. Military logic was giving way to political desperation and personal pride. The result would be a battle unlike anything the world had seen. A fight where neither side could afford to lose, and neither side was allowed to retreat. As German forces approached the outskirts of Stalingrad in late August, neither Hitler nor Stalin understood what they had created. Hitler's obsession with symbolic victories and Stalin's refusal to accept tactical defeats had combined to create the perfect conditions for mutual destruction. 2 massive armies were about to collide in a city that neither could abandon and neither could easily capture. The stage was set for a battle that would consume everything it touched. German logistics were already failing, but Hitler demanded continued attacks. Soviet morale was cracking, but Stalin forbade any retreat. The city of Stalingrad was about to become a killing ground, where the mathematical certainties of modern warfare would be replaced by the primitive brutality of survival at any cost. As German tanks rolled toward Stalin's city, neither dictator realized they were about to create one of the most devastating battles in human history. August 23rd, 1942, the day hell came to Earth. Luftflotte 4 bombers, 1,000 tons of explosives. One afternoon, when the smoke cleared, Stalingrad wasn't a city anymore. It was a crematorium. August 23rd, 1942. The date that would define the Eastern Front for the next 6 months. At 4 in the afternoon, the citizens of Stalingrad heard a sound that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives, the drone of hundreds of German aircraft approaching from the west. General Wolfram von Richthofen, commanding Luftflotte 4, had been planning this moment for weeks. The cousin of the famous Red Baron from the First World War, von Richthofen was himself a decorated pilot and aggressive commander. He'd perfected close air support tactics during the Spanish Civil War and the early Blitzkrieg campaigns. Now he was about to unleash the heaviest bombing raid on the Eastern Front to that date. The plan was devastatingly simple. Wave after wave of Heinkel He-111s, Junkers Ju-88s, and Dornier Do 217s would drop a mixture of high explosive and incendiary bombs across the city. The high explosives would destroy buildings and infrastructure, while the incendiaries would start fires that would spread quickly through Stalingrad's many wooden structures. Von Richthofen intended to create a firestorm that would make the city uninhabitable. The raid would involve approximately 1,600 sorties, with German pilots flying multiple missions throughout the afternoon and into the night. This wasn't a single devastating blow. It was sustained destruction that continued for hours as bomber crews returned to base, rearmed, and flew back to attack different sectors of the city. The methodical nature of the assault meant that civilians who survived the first waves would face repeated attacks as they tried to escape the growing inferno. As the first bombs began falling, civilians who had ignored earlier air raid warnings suddenly realized this wasn't another hit-and-run attack. This was systematic destruction on an industrial scale. Entire city blocks disappeared in clouds of smoke and flame as wave after wave of aircraft worked methodically across Stalingrad from north to south. The human cost defied accurate calculation. Soviet official reports listed 955 killed and 1,181 wounded, but historians consider these figures drastically underestimated. Some estimates suggest casualties ranging into the tens of thousands, with the true number forever unknown because entire families simply vanished in the flames. Bodies were incinerated beyond recognition, and many victims were buried beneath tons of rubble that wouldn't be cleared for years. Families trapped in burning buildings had nowhere to run, as fires consumed all the oxygen in basement shelters. People literally choked to death as the flames sucked away the air they needed to breathe. Others were buried alive as massive apartment buildings collapsed into rubble that would later become perfect defensive positions for Soviet soldiers. Hospital patients burned in their beds as medical staff tried desperately to evacuate facilities under bombardment. Schools became mass graves as children, and teachers were caught in buildings that offered no protection against 500-pound bombs. The Volga River itself seemed to catch fire as oil storage tanks exploded and spread burning petroleum across the water's surface. Barges and boats caught in the inferno added to the destruction as their crews abandoned vessels that had become floating torches. The bombing created a landscape that looked like the surface of the moon. What had been a modern industrial city of 400,000 people was transformed into endless piles of rubble, shattered buildings reduced to skeletal frameworks, and craters filled with the debris of civilization. Entire neighborhoods simply ceased to exist, replaced by smoking wastelands where streets could no longer be distinguished from sidewalks. But von Richthofen's bombers had accomplished more than just mass destruction. They'd inadvertently created the perfect defensive terrain for the upcoming battle. The rubble from destroyed buildings created countless hiding places for snipers and machine gun nests. Streets became impassable to tanks as debris blocked every major thoroughfare. What had been designed as a terror bombing to break Soviet resistance instead provided Soviet defenders with ideal conditions for urban warfare. Modern warfare had just been transported back to the Middle Ages. Coinciding with the bombing raid, General Friedrich Paulus launched his ground assault on the city. The 14th Panzer Corps attacked from the north, while the 51st Corps advanced from the west. German tanks and infantry moved through the suburbs, encountering scattered Soviet resistance that seemed more confused than coordinated. The initial German advance showed promise. Within the first day, advanced elements of the 14th Panzer Corps had fought their way through the northern suburbs and reached positions near the Volga River. German soldiers could see the eastern bank of the Great River that marked one of their furthest advances into the Soviet Union. For a brief moment, it seemed like Stalingrad might fall as easily as other Soviet cities had during the early Blitzkrieg campaigns. But the tactical situation proved more complex than early reports suggested. Soviet forces launched immediate counterattacks designed to prevent German consolidation of their gains. The 62nd, 64th, and 1st Guards armies moved quickly to contain German penetrations and prevent the establishment of permanent positions along the river. What had looked like a breakthrough began to resemble a dangerous salient that could be cut off and destroyed. This was urban warfare as no one had ever experienced it before. Tank crews discovered that their vehicles were almost useless in the rubble-strewn environment, unable to navigate streets blocked by collapsed structures, and vulnerable to infantry attacks from every window and doorway. Panzer commanders trained to fight tank versus tank battles at long range found themselves facing Soviet soldiers armed with anti-tank rifles and grenades at point-blank range. Soviet defenders quickly learned to exploit these conditions. Snipers took position in the upper floors of damaged buildings, using the rubble as camouflage while they picked off German officers and communications personnel. Machine gun teams established overlapping fields of fire across courtyards and intersections, turning every open space into a killing zone. Anti-tank teams armed with rifles and grenades could disable German armor by attacking from close range before disappearing into the maze of destroyed buildings. The advantage that German military technology had provided during the Blitzkrieg campaigns suddenly evaporated in the ruins of Stalingrad. Stukas couldn't distinguish friend from foe when both sides were fighting in the same building. Tank radios were useless when the enemy was close enough to throw grenades through the hatches. Modern combined arms tactics became irrelevant when the battlefield was measured in rooms and stairwells, rather than miles and kilometers. German infantry found urban combat equally challenging and far more personal than anything they'd experienced. Every building had to be cleared room by room, floor by floor, with soldiers never knowing if the next doorway concealed a machine gun nest or a booby trap. Flamethrowers became essential equipment for burning out defenders who couldn't be reached with conventional weapons. High explosive shells were fired directly into buildings at point-blank range to collapse structures on top of their occupants. The fighting was so intense and so close that soldiers on both sides reported being able to hear their enemies breathing on the other side of walls. Bayonets and entrenching tools became more useful than rifles in the hand-to-hand combat that developed when opposing forces met in the same room. Men who had trained to fight battles across miles of open terrain found themselves killing each other with knives and clubs in spaces smaller than most modern bedrooms. Meanwhile, Stalin's not one step back order was being implemented with ruthless efficiency. Soviet blocking detachments armed with machine guns took positions behind their own frontline troops. Any soldier who retreated without explicit authorization would be shot immediately by his own comrades. Commanders who authorized withdrawals faced court-martial and execution, even when tactical retreats might save their men's lives and improve their defensive positions. The psychological impact on Soviet soldiers was devastating. They found themselves trapped between German forces trying to kill them and Soviet forces ready to execute them for cowardice. Many units fought with the desperate courage of men who knew they had no choice but victory or death. Others simply collapsed under the pressure, with soldiers committing suicide rather than face either German bullets or Soviet firing squads. But Stalin had calculated that terror could substitute for tactical flexibility. If Soviet soldiers couldn't retreat, they would have to fight harder and longer than they might otherwise choose to do. The blocking detachments weren't just preventing unauthorized withdrawals, they were forcing ordinary men to become heroes through the simple expedient of making heroism the only alternative to immediate execution. The decision to keep civilians trapped inside the city remains one of the most controversial aspects of Stalin's strategy. Soviet authorities severely limited large-scale evacuations, claiming that transportation resources were needed for military supplies and that workers were essential for continued industrial production. Some historians argue this was a calculated decision to use civilians as human shields, believing that Soviet soldiers would fight harder to protect non-combatants. Others suggest it was primarily a practical decision, based on limited evacuation capabilities and the need to maintain war production. Whatever the motivation, hundreds of thousands of ordinary people became trapped in a battle they had no part in starting. Families huddled in basements, while artillery shells exploded overhead and machine gun bullets shattered the windows of their apartments. Children went to work building tank traps and digging trenches because there was no safe place for them to hide. Elderly civilians took up rifles to defend their neighborhoods because the alternative was watching their homes burn while they waited helplessly for death. The city's industrial capacity was mobilized for the defense with remarkable speed and efficiency. The Stalingrad tractor factory stopped producing agricultural equipment and started manufacturing 34 tanks, even as German shells fell around the production lines. Workers who had been building civilian goods in the morning were assembling weapons and ammunition by afternoon. Factory managers organized their employees into militia units, turning industrial workers into part-time soldiers who would fight for their factories during the day and operate production lines at night. This militarization of civilian life blurred the lines between combatants and non-combatants in ways that would have horrific consequences. German soldiers found it increasingly difficult to distinguish between armed Soviet soldiers and armed Soviet civilians. Both looked the same, both shot at German troops, and both had to be treated as legitimate military targets under the brutal logic of urban warfare. The result was a level of violence against civilians that exceeded even the brutal standards that had been established on the Eastern Front. Medical care became a nightmare for both sides as the battle intensified. Hospitals were primary targets for artillery and bombing because they were large, visible buildings that might house military command posts. Medical personnel faced the impossible task of treating wounded soldiers while under constant fire from snipers and mortars. Evacuation of the wounded became nearly impossible, as stretcher bearers were shot down, trying to reach casualties, lying in the open streets. Soviet medical teams developed new techniques for battlefield surgery under fire, performing operations in basement shelters by candlelight, while artillery shells exploded overhead. German medical units discovered that their field hospitals had to be relocated constantly to avoid Soviet counterattacks. Both sides faced critical shortages of medical supplies as transport networks broke down under the constant bombardment. The logistics of urban warfare proved nightmarish for both armies. Ammunition consumption rates were far higher than anyone had anticipated, because every building had to be bombarded before it could be assaulted. Artillery units found themselves firing more shells in a single day than they would normally use in a week of conventional operations. Machine gun teams went through thousands of rounds, clearing single buildings, and infantry units consumed grenades at rates that outpaced supply convoys. Food and water became precious commodities as supply lines came under constant attack. German supply convoys had to fight their way through Soviet artillery fire and partisan attacks to reach the front lines. Soviet supply operations across the Volga River faced German air attacks and artillery bombardment that sank boats and barges faster than they could be replaced. Soldiers on both sides went days without hot meals, and sometimes without clean water, as the infrastructure of modern military logistics collapsed under the strain of urban combat. Environmental conditions added another layer of misery to the battle. The August heat was intensified by fires that burned continuously throughout the city, creating an oppressive atmosphere that made every physical action more difficult. Smoke from burning buildings reduced visibility to a few yards in many areas, making it impossible for commanders to maintain visual contact with their units. The stench of burning flesh, rotting garbage, and unburied corpses created conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. Communication became nearly impossible in the urban environment. Radio signals were blocked by collapsed buildings and interference from electrical fires. Telephone lines were cut by artillery fire faster than they could be repaired. Commanders found themselves reduced to sending messages by runner, often losing contact with units that were only a few hundred yards away, but separated by impenetrable barriers of rubble and fire. As the battle entered its second week, both Hitler and Stalin remained committed to the fight, despite the mounting costs. Hitler saw Stalingrad as essential for German prestige and Soviet morale, refusing to consider any tactical withdrawal that might preserve his forces for more favorable battles elsewhere. Stalin viewed the city as a symbol of resistance that couldn't be abandoned without undermining the entire Soviet war effort and his own personal authority. Neither dictator was willing to accept the tactical reality that the battle was consuming far more resources than either side could afford to lose. German soldiers began writing home about fighting not men, but devils, who refused to surrender even when surrounded and outnumbered. Soviet soldiers described combat so intense that new arrivals had an average life expectancy measured in hours rather than days. Veterans on both sides developed a hollow-eyed appearance that their comrades recognized as the look of men who had seen too much death and destruction to remain entirely human. The tactical innovations that emerged from urban combat would influence military thinking for generations. Both sides learned to use sewers and subway tunnels for movement and supply, creating underground networks that bypassed surface defenses. Snipers developed new techniques for concealment and movement in urban terrain, turning individual marksmen into strategic assets, capable of disrupting entire enemy operations. Engineers learned to use explosives not just to destroy enemy positions, but to create new defensive positions from the rubble of destroyed buildings. The psychological toll on both armies was becoming impossible to ignore. Soldiers who had survived months of conventional warfare broke down completely after days in the urban inferno of Stalingrad. Combat fatigue, shell shock, and what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder reached epidemic proportions among troops on both sides. Unit cohesion began to break down as the constant stress of urban combat destroyed the bonds of trust and mutual dependence that held military formations together. But the real horror was just beginning. The bombing of August 23rd had created hell on Earth, but the months of fighting that followed would prove that hell could always get worse. As both armies settled in for what would become the longest and bloodiest urban battle in human history, neither side understood that they were about to redefine the very concept of warfare itself. The ruins of Stalingrad were about to become a laboratory for discovering just how much punishment human beings could endure and still continue fighting. The lessons learned in those ruins would haunt military planners for decades, influencing everything from urban combat tactics to the design of modern cities. And the men who survived would carry psychological scars that no victory could heal. As September approached and the initial German assault stalled in the rubble, both sides prepared for a prolonged siege that would test the limits of human endurance. The bombing had created the conditions for an urban nightmare that would consume everything it touched. 27 men, one grain elevator, against the entire German Sixth Army. By the time it was over, German soldiers were calling the defenders devils that no flames or bullets can destroy. Mid-September 1942. The German assault on the Volga River was intensifying. General Friedrich Paulus had spent weeks preparing for this phase of the battle, the decisive push that would capture Stalingrad and secure Germany's foothold on the great river that divided European Russia from Asia. His forces had been grinding through the city's suburbs for nearly a month, paying in blood for every street corner and factory building. But as German troops advanced through the industrial district toward the river, one structure dominated the landscape ahead of them. The Stalingrad grain elevator rose 90 meters long and 35 meters high from the devastated cityscape, a concrete monument to Soviet industrial ambitions. Completed just 2 years earlier in 1940, it had been designed to store grain shipments arriving by rail and river transport. Now it was about to become the site of one of the most remarkable defensive stands in military history. The elevator's staff had long since abandoned their posts to join the city's defense. The massive structure stood empty as German forces approached, its concrete walls scarred by weeks of artillery fire, but still structurally intact. To German tactical planners, it was simply another obstacle to be cleared before their advance could continue. To Senior Lieutenant Ivan Afanasievich Polyakov, it looked like the perfect defensive position. Polyakov was a junior officer with the Soviet Guards Regiment, a man who'd been fighting in Stalingrad for weeks and watching his unit slowly consumed by the brutal urban warfare that characterized every engagement in the city. When he saw German forces approaching the grain elevator, he made a decision that would echo through military history. He would occupy the building with whatever men he could gather and hold it as long as possible. The force that followed Polyakov into the grain elevator was a mixed collection of Soviet defenders, totaling around 30 men. Some were regular soldiers from his own regiment, others were sailors from a naval infantry unit, and still others were militia volunteers who had taken up arms to defend their city. They represented the kind of improvised unit composition that had become common in Stalingrad, where formal military organization had broken down under the pressure of constant combat. What mattered wasn't their official assignments, but their willingness to fight. Their weapons were as improvised as their unit composition. A few had rifles and submachine guns. Others carried nothing but grenades and anti-tank rifles designed for use against armored vehicles. Some had grabbed machine guns from abandoned positions, while others made do with pistols and whatever ammunition they could scrounge from the ruins around them. It was hardly the arsenal you'd expect for a garrison planning to hold a major defensive position against a modern army. But the grain elevator itself was a fortress, waiting for defenders who understood its potential. The concrete walls were thick enough to stop most artillery shells, and robust enough to resist direct hits from all but the largest bombs. The building's height provided excellent observation over the surrounding area, allowing the defenders to direct fire against German forces while remaining protected from return fire. Multiple floors and stairwells created defensive depth, meaning that even if Germans captured part of the building, they would have to fight floor by floor to secure the entire structure. Most importantly, the elevator's location made it impossible for German forces to bypass. It sat directly in the path of the main German advance toward the Volga, commanding key road junctions and river access points. Any German unit that tried to advance past the elevator would come under fire from its defenders, making further progress impossible until the building was captured. Polyakov and his men had turned themselves into a cork in the bottle of German ambitions. The German attack began in mid-September, with what commanders expected would be routine urban combat. Clear the building, eliminate any defenders, and continue the advance toward their objectives on the river. Instead, they encountered resistance that defied every expectation of how desperate defenders should behave when faced with overwhelming odds. The active phase of the siege would last from September 15th to 21st, becoming one of the most intense small unit actions of the entire war. Soviet machine gunners positioned on the upper floors of the elevator opened fire as soon as German infantry came within range. The concrete structure provided perfect protection from German return fire, while offering clear fields of observation over the approaching enemy forces. German soldiers found themselves caught in the open, unable to advance across the killing zone around the elevator, and unable to suppress the defenders with the weapons they carried. The supporting German tanks fared little better. Soviet anti-tank riflemen had positioned themselves at windows and firing ports throughout the building, creating overlapping fields of fire that covered every approach route. Tank crews discovered that their armor provided little protection against high-velocity anti-tank rounds fired from elevated positions at close range. Several German armored vehicles were disabled in the first hours of fighting, their crews forced to abandon their vehicles under intense fire from the elevator's defenders. German commanders quickly realized they faced a more serious problem than anticipated. What should have been a routine building clearance had turned into a siege that was consuming troops and time that Paulus couldn't afford to waste. The German Sixth Army was already behind schedule in its advance toward the Volga, and every day of delay gave Soviet forces more time to organize their defenses along the river. The German response escalated rapidly. If infantry and tanks couldn't clear the grain elevator, they would use artillery and air power to blast the defenders into submission. Heavy guns were brought forward to bombard the structure at close range, while Stuka dive bombers were called in to attack with 500-pound bombs designed to penetrate reinforced concrete. The artillery bombardment began at dawn and continued throughout each day of the siege. German gunners fired hundreds of shells directly into the grain elevator, turning its concrete walls into Swiss cheese and filling the interior with clouds of dust and debris. The sound of the bombardment could be heard across the city as high explosive shells detonated against reinforced concrete in an industrial symphony of destruction. But when the artillery fire lifted and German infantry advanced to occupy the ruined building, they discovered that the defenders were still alive and still fighting. The grain elevator's construction had been designed to withstand the weight of thousands of tons of stored grain, making it far more resistant to explosive damage than ordinary buildings. The Soviet defenders had survived the bombardment by taking shelter in the building's strongest sections, emerging to fight again when German troops approached. German soldier Wilhelm Hoffmann, serving with the 24th Panzer Division, recorded his frustration in a diary that would later be captured by Soviet forces. "The elevator is occupied not by men, but by devils that no flames or bullets can destroy," he wrote, after another failed assault on the building. His unit had been trying to capture the structure for days, losing men in every attempt, while making no progress toward their objective. The psychological impact on German forces was profound and immediate. These were soldiers who had conquered most of Europe through rapid, decisive victories that broke enemy resistance within hours or days. Now, they found themselves stalled by a handful of Soviet defenders who refused to surrender even when facing impossible odds. The contrast between German expectations and Soviet reality was destroying morale and confidence throughout the attacking units. Meanwhile, inside the grain elevator, conditions were becoming increasingly desperate. The building had no running water, no electricity, and no communication with Soviet forces outside the structure. Food consisted of whatever rations the defenders had carried with them when they occupied the building, supplemented by anything they could scavenge from the ruins around them. Medical care was limited to basic first aid with whatever supplies they could improvise from torn clothing and debris. Ammunition was the most critical shortage. The defenders had to ration every bullet and grenade, making each shot count because there would be no resupply from Soviet forces. They learned to collect ammunition from German casualties when possible, stripping weapons and equipment from enemy soldiers who fell within reach of their positions. Some defenders armed themselves entirely with captured German weapons, using enemy equipment against its former owners. The siege intensified through the week with German forces launching multiple attacks each day. On September 18th alone, German units launched 7 separate assaults on the grain elevator, each one repelled by the diminishing garrison of Soviet defenders. German forces brought up flamethrowers to burn out the defenders, only to discover that the concrete structure was largely fire-resistant and that the defenders had learned to avoid areas vulnerable to flame weapons. Combat engineers tried to demolish the building with explosive charges, but the defenders managed to prevent German sappers from getting close enough to place their charges effectively. Every German attempt to end the siege quickly was met by Soviet innovation and determination that seemed to grow stronger as their situation became more hopeless. The defenders had turned desperation into a tactical advantage. Soviet defenders developed ingenious tactics for maximizing their effectiveness despite impossible odds. They learned to move constantly throughout the building, firing from one position and then quickly relocating before German forces could target their location. Single defenders would simulate the firepower of entire squads by using multiple weapons positioned at different firing ports, creating the illusion of a much larger garrison than actually existed. They used mirrors and pieces of metal to reflect sunlight into the eyes of German marksmen, disrupting enemy accuracy during daylight hours. The defenders also became experts at psychological warfare against their besiegers. They would call out taunts and challenges to German soldiers in broken German, demoralizing enemy troops who were already frustrated by their inability to capture the building. At night, they would make noise and create the impression of activity in parts of the building they didn't actually occupy, forcing German forces to waste ammunition firing at empty positions. German tactics evolved in response to Soviet innovations, but always seemed to be one step behind the defenders' adaptations. Infantry units learned to use smoke grenades and covering fire to approach the building under concealment, only to discover that Soviet defenders had memorized every approach route and could target them even in limited visibility. Tank crews tried to position their vehicles where they could fire directly into the building's windows, but Soviet anti-tank teams proved remarkably effective at disabling armored vehicles from concealed positions. The stalemate was consuming resources that both sides desperately needed for other operations. German forces had committed thousands of troops, dozens of armored vehicles, and massive amounts of artillery ammunition to capturing a single building defended by 30 men. Soviet forces couldn't afford to lose any defensive position in Stalingrad, but they also couldn't spare reinforcements to break the siege of the grain elevator. As the siege entered its final days, both sides understood that the situation couldn't continue indefinitely. German commanders were under increasing pressure from higher headquarters to complete their advance toward the Volga River. The grain elevator had become a symbol of German military effectiveness, and its continued resistance was undermining confidence in the Wehrmacht's ability to complete its objectives in Stalingrad. German psychological warfare specialists decided to try a different approach. Instead of continuing the costly frontal assaults, they would attempt to convince the Soviet defenders to surrender through negotiation. German officers recruited Soviet prisoners of war to approach the grain elevator under a white flag and offer terms for surrender. The Soviet collaborators carried a message promising fair treatment for defenders who laid down their arms. German commanders offered medical care for the wounded, adequate food for all survivors, and prisoner of war status under the Geneva Convention. To desperate men who had been fighting without supplies for more than a week, it might have seemed like a reasonable offer to anyone not familiar with German treatment of Soviet prisoners. Polyakov's response was immediate and uncompromising. The Soviet defenders would fight to the death rather than surrender to fascist invaders. They had not occupied the grain elevator to negotiate with the enemy. They had come to kill Germans and die for the Soviet Union if necessary. The surrender offer was rejected without discussion or debate among the defending garrison. The German assault resumed with renewed fury, determined to overwhelm the remaining defenders through sheer weight of force. Infantry units supported by armor and artillery launched coordinated attacks from multiple directions. The fighting reached a level of intensity that shocked even veterans of the brutal urban combat that characterized the battle for Stalingrad. The daily casualty reports told the story of the siege's intensity. German forces were losing dozens of men each day trying to capture a building defended by a garrison that was shrinking with each assault. The defenders lost several more of their already tiny garrison during these final attacks, reducing their effective strength to fewer than 20 men. But they continued to fight with the desperate effectiveness of soldiers who knew that surrender meant death and retreat was impossible. German casualties from the grain elevator siege were becoming impossible to justify to higher commanders. The 24th Panzer Division alone had lost more men trying to capture this single building than they had lost during entire battles in previous campaigns. Unit commanders began questioning the wisdom of continuing operations that consumed so many resources for such limited territorial gains. Meanwhile, the siege was having effects far beyond its immediate tactical significance. Word of the grain elevator's resistance spread throughout the Soviet forces defending Stalingrad, becoming a symbol of what ordinary soldiers could accomplish through determination and sacrifice. If 30 men could hold off thousands of Germans for more than a week, what might be possible if every Soviet unit showed the same level of resistance? German morale suffered correspondingly across units involved in the siege. Soldiers who had conquered France in 6 weeks were spending more than a week trying to capture a single building from a handful of Soviet defenders. The contrast between German expectations and Soviet reality was creating doubt about the Wehrmacht's supposed superiority over its enemies. The tactical lessons emerging from the grain elevator siege would influence urban warfare doctrine for decades. Both sides learned that individual buildings could become strategic assets when defended by determined troops who understood their terrain advantages. The siege demonstrated that modern military technology couldn't always overcome human determination and tactical innovation. On the night of September 21st to 22nd, Polyakov made the decision that would save the lives of his remaining men. The grain elevator could no longer be held against the massive German forces surrounding it, but the defenders didn't have to die uselessly in a final suicidal stand. Under cover of darkness, they would attempt to break out of the building and escape to Soviet lines elsewhere in the city. The breakout required careful planning and perfect timing. German forces had surrounded the grain elevator with machine gun positions and observation posts designed to prevent exactly this kind of escape attempt. But the defenders had spent more than a week studying German positions and had identified weaknesses in the enemy's surveillance network. 15 Soviet defenders, including Polyakov himself, successfully escaped from the grain elevator and reached friendly lines during the night of September 21st to 22nd. The others had died during the siege or were too wounded to attempt the dangerous journey through German-controlled territory. Their sacrifice had tied down significant German forces for nearly a week while inflicting casualties that the Wehrmacht could ill afford. German forces finally occupied the grain elevator on September 22nd, but their victory felt hollow. They had captured a building that was strategically worthless, spending resources and time that could have been used for more important objectives. The grain elevator had become a symbol of German military inefficiency rather than German military effectiveness. The propaganda value of the grain elevator siege proved enormous for Soviet morale throughout the remainder of the battle. Pictures of the devastated structure appeared in Soviet newspapers and propaganda films as proof that ordinary soldiers could resist the supposedly invincible German war machine. The image of the grain elevator became synonymous with Soviet determination and German frustration throughout the battle for Stalingrad. So significant was the grain elevator's symbolic value that some German units later adopted sleeve shields featuring the building as a mark of honor for having participated in its capture. But this honor came at a cost that few German commanders were willing to pay again. The siege had taught both sides lessons about urban warfare that would influence every subsequent engagement in the city. The real significance of the grain elevator siege lay in what it revealed about the changing nature of the war on the Eastern Front. German forces were no longer fighting an enemy that would break and run when faced with superior firepower and tactical skill. They were fighting an enemy that would fight to the death for every building, every room, and every inch of ground. The siege foreshadowed the months of brutal urban combat that would follow. If 30 Soviet defenders could tie down thousands of German troops for a week, what would happen when the entire Soviet army adopted the same tactics? The grain elevator had provided a preview of the urban nightmare that would consume both armies in the ruins of Stalingrad. German commanders began to realize they had walked into a trap of their own making. By choosing to fight for Stalingrad building by building, they had surrendered the advantages of mobility and firepower that had made the Wehrmacht so effective in previous campaigns. Urban warfare favored defenders who could use terrain and determination to offset technological and numerical disadvantages. The grain elevator siege marked a turning point in the German Sixth Army's fortunes. Every day spent fighting for individual buildings was a day not spent advancing towards strategic objectives. Every casualty sustained in urban combat was a soldier who couldn't be replaced from Germany's dwindling reserves. As the siege ended and the battle for Stalingrad continued, both sides understood that they had witnessed something unprecedented. The grain elevator had become proof that individual soldiers could influence the outcome of battles between armies, that determination could overcome firepower, and that the Wehrmacht was not invincible when forced to fight on terms not of its own choosing. The 30 men who defended the grain elevator had changed the character of the entire battle. The lessons learned during those 6 days would be repeated thousands of times in factories, apartment buildings, and railway stations throughout Stalingrad. What had begun as a tactical engagement between 30 Soviet defenders and thousands of German attackers had become a template for the most brutal urban warfare in human history. Every subsequent battle in the city would be measured against the standards set by Polyakov, and his men at the grain elevator. The stand that changed everything had ended, but its effects would echo through every remaining day of the battle for Stalingrad. The 30 defenders had proven that ordinary soldiers could become heroes through extraordinary sacrifice, and that heroes could change the course of history. November 19th, 1942, 7:20 a.m., Moscow time. The sound that changed World War II wasn't a speech or a battle cry. It was the thunder of Soviet artillery, beginning the largest pincer movement in military history. For 3 months, the German Sixth Army had been grinding through Stalingrad, street by street, building by building, room by room. They'd paid in blood for every gain, but they were winning. German forces controlled 90% of the city, and Soviet resistance was cracking under the relentless pressure. General Friedrich Paulus could almost taste victory as his exhausted troops fought for the last pockets of Soviet resistance along the Volga River. But while German soldiers focused on the urban nightmare directly in front of them, Marshal Georgy Zhukov and General Alexander Vasilevsky had been planning something far more ambitious. Working with the Soviet High Command Stavka, they had been quietly assembling the largest trap in military history. Operation Uranus, named after the Greek god who was the great-grandfather of Mars, the god of war. The name implied this operation would be all-encompassing, and the Soviets had the forces to make that promise real. Over 1 million men, 13,500 artillery pieces and rocket launchers, nearly 900 tanks, more than 1,100 aircraft. Since September, Soviet forces had been moving into position north and south of Stalingrad under elaborate deception operations and German overconfidence. German intelligence had detected some of this build-up, but Hitler and his commanders dismissed it as defensive preparations designed to protect the city. They were catastrophically wrong. Soviet planners had studied German tactics for 3 years and identified their fatal weakness. The Wehrmacht's success depended on rapid movement and concentrated firepower, but both advantages disappeared when German forces were tied down in prolonged urban combat. While Paulus's army bled itself white fighting for Stalingrad's ruins, their flanks were being guarded by Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian troops who were far less capable than German units. The Soviets intended to crush these Allied armies and trap the entire German Sixth Army in the city they'd been fighting so hard to capture. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. 2 massive Soviet army groups would attack simultaneously, one north of Stalingrad against Romanian Third Army, another south of the city against Romanian Fourth Army. Both attacks would drive west behind German lines, meeting somewhere near the town of Kalachi to complete the encirclement. The German Sixth Army would be cut off from supply and reinforcement, trapped in the urban wasteland they'd created through months of devastating bombardment. At 7:20 a.m. on November 19th, the northern attack began with devastating artillery preparation. Approximately 3,500 Soviet guns, mortars, and rocket launchers opened fire on Romanian positions north of the city. The bombardment continued for 80 minutes as rolling concentrations of fire systematically destroyed Romanian command posts, communication lines, and defensive positions. The sound could be heard 50 miles away as Soviet artillery methodically prepared the battlefield for the assault to follow. Romanian soldiers had never experienced anything like this industrial-scale destruction. Many of their positions were obliterated under the weight of high-explosive shells, but others fought back with surprising tenacity. The Romanian 1st Armoured Division and several infantry units put up determined resistance against impossible odds. But individual courage couldn't overcome the massive disparity in firepower, numbers, and tactical surprise that the Soviets had achieved. When the artillery fire shifted to deeper targets, Romanian defenders saw something that tested even the bravest men's resolve. Dozens of Soviet T-34 tanks were advancing across the snow-covered steppe, directly toward their positions. Behind the tanks came waves of Soviet infantry, their winter camouflage making them almost invisible against the white landscape. The Romanians were about to be overrun by forces they had limited ability to stop. Romanian Third Army fought as well as could be expected under the circumstances. Individual units conducted desperate defensive actions against overwhelming odds, trying to hold positions that had been damaged or destroyed by the preliminary bombardment. Anti-tank guns managed to destroy some Soviet armor before being overwhelmed by infantry attacks. But courage and determination couldn't change the fundamental mathematics of the battle. Within hours, Romanian Third Army was in general retreat. While some units maintained good order during their withdrawal, others became disorganized as command structures broke down under the intensity of the Soviet assault. Soviet tank crews reported that they were advancing so rapidly they had to coordinate carefully to avoid outrunning their own infantry support. The northern pincer of Operation Uranus was ahead of schedule before the sun set on the first day. Put yourself in Paulus's position. You're fighting desperately to capture a city when suddenly your entire army is threatened with encirclement. What's the right choice when both options seem impossible? 24 hours later, the southern attack began with equal effectiveness. Over 1,000 Katyusha rockets blasted Romanian Fourth Army positions south of Stalingrad. The multiple rocket launchers, nicknamed Stalin's organs by German soldiers, created a different kind of terror than conventional artillery. Their distinctive shriek, followed by massive explosions, struck both Romanian defensive positions and Romanian morale simultaneously. Soviet forces in the south advanced in a two-pronged formation designed to bypass Stalingrad entirely while cutting German supply lines to the west. Tank commanders had been ordered to ignore German strongpoints and drive directly toward their objectives, leaving isolated enemy units to be handled by following infantry. Speed was more important than complete destruction. The goal was encirclement, not annihilation of every enemy unit. Romanian Fourth Army faced the same overwhelming odds that had destroyed their northern comrades. Some units fought effectively despite impossible conditions, while others found their positions untenable and withdrew toward German lines. The Soviet advance was so rapid that many Romanian formations were bypassed and cut off before they could organize effective resistance. Within 48 hours, both Romanian armies had been shattered as effective fighting forces. German commanders initially dismissed early reports of the Soviet attacks as exaggerated, Romanian units were known for inconsistent reporting, especially when under pressure from large-scale enemy operations. Surely some Soviet probing attacks were being blown out of proportion by Allied units that lacked experience with major combat operations. But as more reports came in from different sectors, the scope of the disaster became impossible to ignore. On November 23rd, the two Soviet pincers met near the town of Kalachi, west of Stalingrad. The encirclement was complete. The German Sixth Army, elements of 4th Panzer Army, and various support units, 265,000 men total, were trapped in what would be called the Stalingrad cauldron. Paulus understood immediately that he faced the most critical decision of his military career. His army could attempt to break out of the encirclement, while Soviet forces were still consolidating their positions. German units were experienced, well-equipped, and motivated by the knowledge that failure meant death or capture. If they moved quickly and concentrated their remaining strength, they might be able to punch through Soviet lines and escape to safety. But breakout operations were risky and would require abandoning most of the army's heavy equipment. Tanks, artillery, and vehicles would have to be destroyed to prevent their capture by Soviet forces. Wounded soldiers who couldn't march would have to be left behind to face whatever treatment Soviet troops might provide to German prisoners. It would be a retreat that looked dangerously like a rout, exactly the kind of operation that Hitler had forbidden throughout the war. The alternative was to hold position and wait for relief from German forces outside the encirclement. Hitler was already talking about organizing rescue operations to break through Soviet lines and re-establish contact with the trapped Sixth Army. If Paulus could hold on for a few weeks, German reinforcements might break the siege and allow his forces to resume their advance toward the Volga. It was a gamble, but it preserved the army's equipment and avoided the humiliation of retreat. Paulus understood that military logic favored immediate breakout. Every day of delay would strengthen Soviet positions and weaken German capabilities. Some of his staff officers discussed contingency planning for abandoning Stalingrad and fighting their way west toward friendly lines. But Paulus was a German officer, trained in the Prussian tradition of absolute obedience to superior authority, and his chief of staff, Arthur Schmidt, strongly supported following Hitler's orders. Hitler's response to the encirclement was swift and uncompromising. The Sixth Army would hold its positions at all costs. There would be no retreat, no abandonment of territory, and no admission that German forces could be defeated by Soviet armies. Instead, the Luftwaffe would supply the trapped army by air, while German reinforcements broke through to relieve them. This decision would doom 265,000 men. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, assured Hitler that German air power could keep the Sixth Army supplied indefinitely. He pointed to previous successful airlift operations, where German transport aircraft had supplied isolated garrisons for weeks or months. The Luftwaffe had performed miracles before. Surely they could do so again at Stalingrad. What Göring didn't adequately emphasize was that none of those previous operations had involved anything close to the scale required at Stalingrad. The trapped army needed a minimum of 500 tons of supplies per day: food, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, and spare parts. Paulus himself had calculated that 750 tons per day would be needed to maintain full combat effectiveness. These numbers were far beyond anything the Luftwaffe had ever attempted in such conditions. The mathematics were challenging and unforgiving. The primary German transport aircraft was the Junkers Ju-52, a reliable workhorse that could carry about 2.5 tons of cargo under ideal conditions. To deliver 500 tons per day would require several hundred aircraft, making successful round trips daily. But aircraft needed maintenance, crews needed rest, weather conditions were rapidly deteriorating, and Soviet air defenses were strengthening every day. Luftwaffe analysts understood the mission's difficulty before it began. They calculated that delivering the required supplies would need several hundred transport aircraft operating continuously under favorable conditions. The Luftwaffe had nowhere near that many transports available for the Stalingrad operation, and those they had were needed for other missions across the vast German front. But Göring had promised Hitler that the mission would succeed, so the Luftwaffe would attempt the nearly impossible. The airlift began on November 24th with high hopes and immediate problems. German transport aircraft had to fly through increasingly effective Soviet air defenses while operating from airfields that were under constant attack. Soviet fighters had learned to target the slow, heavily loaded transports during their most vulnerable moments: takeoff, landing, and the long straight approaches required for cargo delivery. Weather conditions made every flight a gamble with death. November and December brought blizzards, ice storms, and temperatures that froze aircraft engines and made runways unusable for days at a time. Transport crews found themselves flying through conditions that would ground civilian aviation while carrying loads that pushed their aircraft beyond safe operating limits. Inside the Stalingrad pocket, German soldiers quickly realized that the promised airlift was failing to meet their needs. Instead of the 500 tons of supplies they needed daily, they were receiving less than 100 tons on good days, and nothing at all when weather or Soviet attacks grounded the transport fleet. Rations were cut in half, then cut in half again as the supply situation became increasingly desperate. Fuel shortages meant that German tanks and vehicles became immobile, turning armored units into stationary artillery positions. Artillery batteries had to ration ammunition, firing only at the most critical targets, while Soviet forces grew stronger every day. Medical supplies ran out completely, leaving German doctors to perform surgery without anesthesia and treat wounds with torn clothing used as bandages. The psychological impact on German troops was severe. These were soldiers who had conquered most of Europe through rapid, decisive campaigns that ended in victory within weeks or months. Now they found themselves trapped in a frozen wasteland, slowly starving while their own air force proved incapable of adequately supporting them. Letters home became increasingly concerned as soldiers realized their situation was deteriorating rather than improving. Soviet forces tightened the siege methodically. Artillery batteries targeted German airfields within the pocket, making supply operations even more dangerous and unreliable. Anti-aircraft guns were positioned along flight routes, forcing German pilots to fly longer, more dangerous approaches that consumed precious fuel. Fighter patrols hunted German transports with increasing effectiveness as Soviet air strength grew and German air power diminished. The human cost was mounting on both sides, but the Germans were paying a higher price in proportion to their resources. Soviet forces could be reinforced and resupplied across the winter landscape, though not without significant difficulties of their own. German forces were slowly consuming their own strength with limited possibility of replacement. Every German casualty was difficult to replace. Every piece of destroyed equipment was irreplaceable under current conditions. Some historians argue that Hitler's decision to hold Stalingrad had limited strategic merit by tying up Soviet resources temporarily. But the cost in German reserves was enormous and ultimately unsustainable. The trapped Sixth Army was consuming German aircraft, pilots, fuel, and supplies that were desperately needed on other fronts. The attempt to supply the trapped army was seriously weakening the Luftwaffe, while accomplishing little except prolonging the inevitable. In late November, German High Command began organizing relief operations from outside the encirclement. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein was tasked with creating Army Group Don and breaking through Soviet lines to re-establish contact with the trapped Sixth Army. The preparations took several weeks as German forces were assembled from other sectors and organized for the relief operation. Manstein launched Operation Winterstorm on December 12th, using the best German units available to punch through Soviet encirclement forces. For several days, it looked like the relief operation might succeed as German armor advanced to within 30 miles of the trapped Sixth Army. But Manstein's forces were insufficient to complete the breakthrough against strengthening Soviet resistance. Hitler had refused to provide adequate reinforcements for the relief operation, claiming they were needed to defend other sectors of the front. The relief operation stalled, just as Soviet forces launched new attacks designed to eliminate the Stalingrad pocket entirely. By Christmas, it was clear that no external rescue was feasible under current conditions. Inside the pocket, conditions had deteriorated drastically. German soldiers were receiving 200 grams of bread per day, less than a single slice by modern standards. Horse meat became a luxury when horses could be found and slaughtered before they froze to death. Some units resorted to eating rats, leather equipment, and anything else that might provide minimal nutrition, though such desperate measures were not universal. Medical care collapsed as supplies ran out, and doctors began suffering from the same diseases and malnutrition that affected their patients. Typhus, dysentery, and frostbite reached serious proportions among troops who lacked adequate clothing, shelter, and nutrition needed to survive a Russian winter. German soldiers who had conquered Europe were dying from diseases that had been largely controlled in modern armies. The most haunting account of German suffering came from Dr. Kurt Reuber, a physician and pastor serving with the trapped army. His description of Christmas Eve 1942 would become one of the most powerful testimonies to the human cost of military disaster. "I spent Christmas evening with the other doctors and the sick," Reuber wrote in his diary. "We raised our mugs and drank to those we love. But before we had a chance to taste the wine, we had to throw ourselves flat on the ground as a stick of bombs fell outside. I seized my doctor's bag and ran to the scene of the explosions where there were dead and wounded. My shelter, with its lovely Christmas decorations, became a dressing station. Räuber's account captured the surreal horror of trying to maintain human dignity in increasingly inhumane conditions. One of the dying men had been hit in the head, and there was nothing I could do for him. He had been with us at our celebration, and had only that moment left to go on duty. But before he went, he said, "I'll finish the carol first." A few moments later, he was dead. There was plenty of hard and sad work to do in our Christmas shelter. On the back of a captured Soviet map, Räuber sketched a picture of the Madonna and Child that became known as the Stalingrad Madonna. He hung it on the wall of his bunker, where it became a shrine for German soldiers looking for comfort during humanity's darkest season. The drawing represented everything the trapped army had lost: home, family, hope, and the possibility of seeing another Christmas. The Luftwaffe's most successful day highlighted the hopelessness of the situation. On December 19th, German transport aircraft managed to deliver 363 tons of supplies to the trapped army, the highest single-day total of the entire airlift operation. But this maximum effort was still less than 3/4 of the minimum required for basic survival, and it came at a cost in aircraft and crews that couldn't be sustained indefinitely. Soviet counterattacks against German airlift bases demonstrated the vulnerability of the entire supply operation. The Red Air Force launched a devastating attack on Tatsinskaya airfield, the main base for German transport operations. Soviet aircraft and ground forces destroyed or captured approximately 72 Ju-52s and several Heinkel He-111s, along with massive amounts of fuel and ammunition, destined for the encircled Sixth Army. The attack demonstrated that even the airlift bases were vulnerable to Soviet operations that could eliminate German air power entirely. Everyone in Hitler's inner circle could see the mathematical truth written in daily supply reports. The Luftwaffe couldn't consistently deliver the supplies needed to keep Paulus and his men combat effective, while German fighter pilots were struggling to maintain air superiority above Stalingrad. Winter weather was making flight operations even more dangerous and unreliable, as pilots tried to operate in conditions that challenged the limits of human endurance. The Volga River had frozen solid in places, allowing Soviet forces to drive trucks loaded with supplies directly across the ice to their own forces defending the city. While German soldiers faced severe shortages, Soviet troops were receiving adequate supplies for continuing operations, though they faced their own logistical challenges. The contrast between the two armies' supply situations was becoming increasingly favorable to the Soviets. Soviet forces used their supply advantage to launch continuous attacks designed to shrink the German perimeter and eliminate resistance pockets one by one. Every German defensive position that fell reduced the area that needed to be supplied by air, while providing Soviet forces with captured equipment and intelligence about German capabilities. The pocket was slowly being compressed into an area too small to adequately contain the forces trapped within it. Some German officers began discussing desperate options: unauthorized breakout attempts, or surrendering units to preserve their men's lives. A few commanders started expending all available ammunition in attacks, making further resistance impossible and effectively forcing their units to surrender. Others began planning unauthorized breakout attempts, designed to save their men's lives, even if it meant court-martial and execution for disobeying orders. By the end of December, the situation had become critical for the trapped German forces. The German Sixth Army was consuming its remaining strength, while Soviet forces continued to receive reinforcements and supplies. The airlift was failing to meet minimum requirements. The relief attempts had been defeated, and winter weather was making survival increasingly difficult for troops who lacked adequate food, clothing, and shelter. But the army would continue fighting for 2 more months, demonstrating the remarkable endurance of soldiers pushed beyond normal human limits. The trapped forces would not surrender until early February 1943, after experiencing conditions that tested every aspect of human survival. Their resistance would tie up significant Soviet resources, while consuming German reserves at an unsustainable rate. The hunters had become the hunted, and the trap was slowly tightening. 265,000 German soldiers were about to discover that military disaster could take forms they had never imagined in their worst nightmares. The perfect trap had been sprung, and escape was becoming increasingly unlikely with each passing day. As 1942 became 1943, the world would witness what happened when the most powerful army in Europe met an enemy that refused to accept defeat. The lesson would be written in blood and suffering across the frozen ruins of Stalingrad. Of 265,000 men who entered Stalingrad, only 91,000 lived to see Soviet prison camps. Of those 91,000, only 6,000 ever saw Germany again. This is the story of what broke the other 259,000. January 9th, 1943. The surviving German troops had been squeezed into an ever-shrinking pocket, while the German army outside the encirclement struggled to hold back Soviet offensives across the entire Eastern Front. To everyone except Hitler, the end for Paulus and his troops was clearly approaching. The mathematics of destruction had become inescapable. The German Sixth Army was consuming itself from within, while Soviet forces grew stronger every day. It was at this point that the Soviets decided to offer terms instead of continuing the slaughter. Soviet aircraft rained down thousands of leaflets onto the German positions, outlining generous conditions for surrender that seemed almost too good to believe. The surrender offer promised that German soldiers would not be harmed if they laid down their arms without resistance. Regular rations would be provided to all prisoners, and medical attention would be given to the sick and wounded. After the war ended, the men would be permitted to return to Germany or to whatever country they chose to call home. For soldiers who had been surviving on 200 grams of bread per day, the promise of regular meals was almost unimaginably attractive. For men who had watched their comrades die from treatable wounds because medical supplies had run out, the promise of medical care represented salvation itself. For troops who had spent months trapped in a frozen wasteland, the promise of eventual repatriation offered hope where none had existed before. But Hitler had made it clear throughout the war that no surrender was permitted under any circumstances. German soldiers were expected to fight to the death rather than accept the humiliation of captivity. Paulus, despite his growing awareness of his army's desperate situation, fell into line with the Führer's expectations and refused the Soviet offer without consulting his subordinate commanders. The refusal sealed the fate of everyone still alive in the Stalingrad pocket. An overwhelming sense of doom settled over every man who understood that they were now condemned to fight until death or complete physical collapse made further resistance impossible. Some soldiers responded to this hopelessness by fighting even harder, determined to take as many Soviet soldiers with them as possible. Others simply gave in to despair and waited passively for the end to come. The psychological pressure of the situation began to manifest in ways that tested military discipline. While the Wehrmacht's organizational structure remained largely intact, incidents of insubordination became more common as men realized that military protocol seemed meaningless when death was inevitable. Fights occasionally broke out over scraps of food, pieces of fuel, and anything else that might extend life for a few more hours or days. There were isolated incidents of soldiers attacking their officers, though the military hierarchy generally held together better than might have been expected under such extreme conditions. The breakdown of normal life was accompanied by desperate measures that revealed how far civilized men could fall when pushed beyond human endurance. Soviet reports later claimed that some German soldiers resorted to cannibalism, eating the flesh of dead comrades to stay alive, though such allegations were never conclusively documented by German sources. What is certain is that soldiers committed suicide rather than face the slow death of starvation or the uncertainty of Soviet captivity. Some troops inflicted wounds on themselves hoping to secure places on evacuation flights, though such self-mutilation was not widespread. Medical conditions inside the pocket had deteriorated beyond anything experienced by European armies in modern warfare. Typhus, dysentery, and frostbite had reached epidemic proportions among troops who lacked the most basic necessities for survival in a Russian winter. German field hospitals became places where doctors could do nothing except watch their patients die from diseases that would have been easily treatable under normal conditions. The accumulation of unburied corpses created sanitary conditions that accelerated the spread of disease throughout the remaining garrison. The civilian population trapped inside the pocket faced equally horrific conditions. Soviet and German civilians alike were caught between the opposing armies, often used as forced labor by whichever side controlled their area at any given moment. German forces pressed civilians into service for military construction and supply operations, while Soviet forces faced the impossible choice of treating German civilians as enemies or potential allies. The breakdown of normal social order created situations where survival often depended on abandoning previous moral principles. Meanwhile, the German airlift that was supposed to keep the Sixth Army supplied continued its inevitable collapse. The repeated flights in and out of the Stalingrad pocket had taken a terrible toll on both aircraft and aircrew, with planes breaking down from the strain and pilots suffering from exhaustion that made safe operations increasingly dangerous. Soviet air defenses had become increasingly effective at intercepting German transport aircraft, while winter weather made flying an extremely hazardous operation, even without enemy interference. In one incident that illustrated the desperation of German aircrews, aircrew members reported throwing whatever objects they could find at attacking Soviet fighters after running out of ammunition. Personal items, tools, and anything else available became improvised weapons in pathetic attempts to ward off enemy aircraft that were destroying the lifeline, keeping German ground forces alive. The incident captured both the courage of German air crews and the hopelessness of their mission. Winter weather conditions made every flight a gamble, with mechanical failure and pilot error. The airfields inside the Stalingrad pocket were frequently shut down for days at a time due to heavy snow, thick ice, and dense fog that made landing impossible even for the most experienced pilots. Additionally, these airfields were heavily cratered by constant Soviet artillery and rocket bombardments that made safe landings increasingly unlikely with each passing day. The poor visibility caused by winter weather created additional hazards for aircraft trying to land on damaged runways. It was not uncommon for aircrews to miss bomb craters that had been concealed by fresh snowfall, resulting in landing gear damage that trapped both aircraft and crew inside the pocket with the soldiers they had been trying to resupply. Many transport crews found themselves fighting as infantry alongside the men they had been supporting from the air. Only the wounded were supposed to be given places on aircraft, leaving the pocket for medical treatment at hospitals outside the encirclement. But as Paulus's army was slowly crushed by starvation, disease, and constant combat, the number of wounded far exceeded the limited space available on transport aircraft. The competition for evacuation flights became another source of tension among troops, who understood that leaving the pocket represented their only realistic chance of survival. German authorities did authorize the evacuation of several hundred German women working with Wehrmacht medical units inside the pocket, recognizing that they faced particular dangers if captured by Soviet forces. These evacuations took place over several weeks, as transport aircraft allocated space for getting civilian medical personnel to safety when possible. The decision reflected practical concerns about the treatment of female prisoners, rather than any broader humanitarian considerations. On January 16th, the Soviets captured the German airfield at Pitomnik, which had been the main base for German supply operations within the pocket. The loss of Pitomnik was particularly devastating because it had a long concrete runway capable of handling large transport aircraft under relatively safe conditions. German engineers demonstrated remarkable efficiency by building a new airfield at Gumrak in just 2 days, but it was hardly a suitable replacement for the facilities they had lost. By this point, the Luftwaffe had lost so many aircraft and air crews that maintaining even minimal supply operations was becoming impossible. On January 20th alone, 6 transport aircraft were destroyed in landing accidents inside the pocket, as pilots tried to operate under conditions that made safe flight operations nearly impossible. Paulus reported to his superiors that when aircraft could not land, it meant the death of his army by starvation and exposure. The mathematical reality of the situation had become undeniable. From the original force of 265,000 troops trapped in November, fewer than 100,000 remained alive by mid-January. The rest had died from wounds, disease, starvation, freezing, or suicide, as the conditions inside the pocket deteriorated beyond human endurance. Even fantasies of breaking out had become impossible because the survivors lacked the physical strength to march, much less fight their way through Soviet forces. At 12:20 p.m. on January 22nd, 1943, the last Junkers Ju-52 transport aircraft landed inside the Stalingrad pocket. The next day, the final evacuation flights were undertaken by Heinkel, He-111 bombers that had been converted for transport duties. After January 23rd, no more German aircraft would reach the trapped army. The men who remained were completely cut off from the outside world and dependent entirely on whatever supplies they could scavenge from the ruins around them. The Luftwaffe continued dropping supplies by parachute, but most of these drops fell into Soviet-controlled territory or were scattered by wind across areas where German troops could not safely retrieve them. Over the course of nearly 2.5 months, the airlift that was supposed to deliver a minimum of 500 tons of supplies per day had averaged a pathetic 114.6 tons. At the cost of 466 aircraft and thousands of aircrew members, the operation had accomplished nothing except prolonging the agony of the doomed army. On January 26th, the German pocket was split in two by a Soviet attack that cut the remaining forces into northern and southern groups that could no longer coordinate their resistance effectively. Even at this late stage, Hitler remained convinced that the German soldiers inside the pocket could somehow achieve a miracle that would save them from destruction. His detachment from reality had become so complete that he was issuing orders based on wishful thinking rather than any assessment of actual conditions. On January 30th, 1943, Paulus received news that would define the final hours of his command. Hitler had promoted him to Field Marshal, making him one of the youngest generals to reach that rank in German military history. Along with this promotion came a pointed reminder from the Führer that no German field marshal had ever been captured alive by enemy forces. Some historians interpret this promotion as evidence that Hitler still believed Paulus could somehow save his army and complete the capture of Stalingrad. Others see it as a more sinister message, an instruction for Paulus to commit suicide rather than face the humiliation of surrender. Hitler also promoted various other officers and awarded medals in what appeared to be a final gesture toward men who were facing certain death or capture. Paulus certainly interpreted the promotion as Hitler's way of ordering him to kill himself rather than surrender to Soviet forces. His response revealed both his exhaustion with Nazi ideology and his determination to survive if possible. "I have no intention of shooting myself for this Bohemian corporal," he reportedly said to his staff, using a derogatory term for Hitler that emphasized the Austrian leader's humble origins. By this time, some German officers were taking it upon themselves to end the resistance in whatever way they could. At least one general ordered his troops to expend all of their remaining ammunition in hopeless attacks, making any further resistance impossible and effectively forcing his unit to surrender. Other commanders began planning to disobey Hitler's orders and surrender their men to save whatever lives remained. On January 31st at midday, Paulus's own headquarters position was overrun by Soviet forces, and he was taken prisoner, along with his staff. The newly promoted field marshal surrendered himself and his immediate command, though isolated pockets of German resistance continued in other parts of the shrinking perimeter. General Karl Strecker continued to command the northern pocket until February 2nd, when the last organized German resistance finally ended. The Battle of Stalingrad officially concluded on February 2nd, 1943, after approximately 5 months and 1 week of urban warfare that had no parallel in human history. When the shooting finally stopped, the silence that fell over the ruined city seemed almost unnatural after months of constant artillery fire, bombing, and small arms combat. Stalingrad had been transformed from a modern industrial city into a wasteland that resembled an archaeological site of some ancient catastrophe. Of the 265,000 German and Axis troops who had been trapped inside the Stalingrad pocket, only 91,000 emerged alive to enter Soviet captivity. The rest had died from wounds, disease, starvation, freezing, suicide, or combat during the 2.5 months of the siege. But even for those who survived to see Soviet prison camps, the ordeal was far from over. The march to Soviet prison camps became another form of death sentence for men who were already weakened by months of starvation and disease. German prisoners were forced to walk hundreds of miles through the Russian winter without adequate food, clothing, or medical care. Many collapsed and died along the route, while others arrived at the camps in such poor condition that they died within days or weeks of their arrival. Soviet treatment of German prisoners was harsh, reflecting both the brutal nature of the Eastern Front and Soviet desires for revenge after years of German occupation and atrocities. The prisoners were put to work on construction projects and industrial operations under conditions that continued to claim lives at alarming rates. Disease, malnutrition, and exhaustion remained constant threats even after the fighting had ended. The final statistics tell the story of one of the most complete military disasters in history. Of the 91,000 German soldiers who entered Soviet captivity at Stalingrad, approximately 6,000 would eventually return to Germany. That represents a survival rate of less than 7% for those who lived long enough to be captured, and approximately 2% for all the men who had been trapped in the pocket. A small number of German soldiers continued to hide in the ruins of Stalingrad for months after the official surrender, surviving by scavenging and avoiding Soviet patrols. These included some Soviet prisoners of war who had volunteered to fight with the Germans against Stalin's regime and knew they faced execution if captured. For these men, there was no possibility of surrender, and very few were taken alive during the Soviet cleanup operations that continued throughout the spring of 1943. Friedrich Paulus himself survived Soviet captivity and was eventually repatriated to East Germany in 1953. By then, he had become a critic of the Nazi regime and supporter of the Soviet-backed government in East Germany. Whether this conversion was genuine or simply a survival strategy, Paulus lived to see his homeland again, while most of his soldiers remained buried in the frozen ground around Stalingrad. The battle had become more than just a military engagement. It represented the clash between two totalitarian ideologies that were willing to sacrifice millions of lives rather than admit defeat. For both Hitler and Stalin, Stalingrad had become a symbol that justified any price in human suffering. The soldiers who died there were victims not just of enemy action, but of political leaders who valued abstract concepts of prestige and ideology more than human life. Total casualties for the Battle of Stalingrad are estimated at approximately 2 million people, making it one of the bloodiest battles in human history. This figure includes military casualties on both sides, as well as civilian deaths from bombing, starvation, disease, and the general breakdown of civilized life that characterized the siege. The human cost was staggering, affecting families and communities across Europe for generations to come. The Battle of Stalingrad marked the beginning of the end for Hitler's thousand-year Reich. The destruction of the Sixth Army eliminated some of Germany's most experienced troops and demonstrated that the Wehrmacht was not invincible when forced to fight under unfavorable conditions. More importantly, it opened the road for Stalin's army to begin its advance toward Berlin that would end with Soviet flags flying over the ruins of the Nazi capital. The psychological impact on German morale was enormous. The army that had conquered most of Europe in rapid campaigns had been slowly consumed by an enemy that refused to surrender even when facing impossible odds. German soldiers on other fronts began to understand that the war could be lost and that their own military superiority was not guaranteed under all circumstances. For the Soviet Union, Stalingrad became proof that their system could survive the worst that Nazi Germany could inflict. The city that refused to surrender had destroyed an entire German army and changed the course of the war. Soviet propaganda would use the victory to demonstrate that communist will could overcome fascist technology and tactics. The 6,000 German survivors who eventually returned to their homeland carried psychological scars that no victory could heal. They had witnessed the complete breakdown of military order and experienced conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. Their stories served as testimony to what happens when political leaders choose symbols over strategy and ideology over human welfare. In the end, Stalingrad became proof that even the mightiest armies can be broken when they are led by leaders who refuse to acknowledge reality. The 265,000 men who entered the battle believing they were conquering a city discovered instead that they were walking into a trap that would consume almost all of them. The lesson written in blood across the frozen ruins would echo through history as a warning about the cost of political obsession and military hubris. When empires choose pride over pragmatism, soldiers pay the ultimate price. And at Stalingrad, that price was paid in full. Remember that number, 265,000. It wasn't just the size of Hitler's trapped army. It was the exact moment his empire began to die. Those men walked into Stalingrad, believing they were conquering a city. Instead, they discovered that empires aren't destroyed by enemies. They're destroyed by leaders who refuse to admit they're wrong. Hitler's obsession with symbols over strategy turned military logic into mass suicide. The irony is perfect and terrible. By trying to capture Stalin's city, Hitler gave Stalin the momentum to begin the advance that would eventually reach Berlin. The road from Stalingrad led directly to the Führer's bunker, where the man who condemned 250,000 soldiers to death would finally face the consequences of his own decisions. Today's leaders making decisions based on ego instead of reality should remember Stalingrad. Pride kills more armies than enemy bullets. Military academies worldwide study this disaster. Urban warfare doctrine draws lessons from these ruins. Politicians should remember its warnings about the cost of refusing to accept reality. So, here's the final question. In your own life, when has pride kept you in a losing position longer than logic demanded? We all have our moments when ego overrules evidence. 265,000 men entered hell, believing they were heroes. Only 6,000 came home to tell the truth, that the 1,000-year Reich died in the ruins of a city that refused to surrender. Stalin's order of not one step back had ultimately stopped Hitler's empire from taking one step forward. And sometimes that's how empires end. Not with conquest, but with the simple refusal to give up.